Hey there, my name's Rod Yates and you're listening to Humans of Music, a Jaxsta podcast. Each episode I talk to a music creator or industry professional about their life and career, the ups and downs of their journey and the lessons they've learned along the way. And my guest today is musician, producer, inventor, author, and president and CEO of A2IM, Richard Burgess. How many times have you heard the terms New Romantic or EDM? Well, Richard is often credited as being responsible for naming both of those genres. He also invented the world's first electronic drum kit in the Simmons SDS5, produced the first two albums by Spandau Ballet, which included hit singles like To Cut a Long Story Short, pioneered the use of synthesizers, sampling and computers in music, and recorded with artists such as Kate Bush. He also forged his own successful career as a musician, perhaps most notably with the band Landscape. They had a top 5 hit in the UK with 1981's Einstein A Go-Go off their second album From the Tea Rooms of Mars to the Hellholes of Uranus. And that is literally just scraping the surface of Richard's incredible career. As of today, Richard is using his decades of experience to help promote growth and awareness of independent music in his role as president and CEO of A2IM, the American Association of Independent Music. And later on in the interview, Richard shares some amazing insights into the current state of the industry. So where do you start when talking with someone who has achieved so much? Well, I guess the beginning is as good a place as any. So we kick things off by talking about the day Richard and his family arrived in New Zealand from England, which in those days must have seemed like going to a different planet.
Well, it did, yeah. I mean, it was, 1959. I was 9 when we left. I was 10 when I got there. It was 6 weeks on a troop carrier called the Captain Cook, appropriately, and I was super happy. I mean, I'm a complete introvert and I'm a book person, and they had a library. I read every book on New Zealand history. When I got there, I knew more about Maoris and New Zealand history than the kids in school, it turned out. So I had a fantastic time, actually, and other people were going crazy. And we became for 2 weeks in the Pacific, so I just thought it was great. I mean, it was the equator, coming from England, which is always rainy and cold, and, the equator's warm and nice and sunny, and it was fantastic.
And am I right in thinking that you'd already been bitten by the music bug? That I think you saw a marching band when you were around 2 or 3, and that had sort of sparked an interest in, at least in rhythm and drums.
Totally, yeah. We used to have, funny, my birthday week was always, they had this big sort of fair down on the recreation grounds where I grew up in the Midlands of the UK. I mean, I was born in London, but I grew up in the Midlands. And my parents used to go down there every year, and I remember they had the Marine Band and various other bands. And I can remember the power of the drum section going by, and that was just like a formative moment for me. I want that. This GI gave me a ukulele, and it was a Gretsch ukulele. I did not appreciate that at the time until many years later. It just seemed like, a toy ukulele, but it was a really, really beautiful ukulele that he gave me. And so that was really my first instrument. And I moved to drums when I was about 14. I mean, obviously I had all kinds of objections. They're loud, right? But I just did it in the end. So.
And I mean, your parents, by the sounds of things, at least had a love of music, because I understand that they actually took you to clubs when you were quite young, and you had a friend who was a family friend who was a professional or semi-professional singer. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, we used to travel around with this girl. She was a woman to me, but she was 18, 19, 20, something like that. She was a singer, and we'd go to lots of clubs, and my mother loved to dance. They loved music. We always had the radio on in my house, and but I used to sit there. They'd give us, as they call it in England, crisps, pop and crisps, and so anyway, I'd just sit there and just down bags and bags of these crisps and drink, God knows what it was, lemonade or something. Not American lemonade though. It's like 7-Up, I guess, and. Just watch the drama. That was all. I don't know why. I have no idea what the attraction was, but I was just completely obsessed with drummers. I used to watch this guy at the Working Men's Club and stuff, and that sort of inspired me as well.
So when you finally got a drum kit at the age of 14, what did that represent to you?
Oh, it was the most exciting thing. I mean, I set it up in my room, and I used to wake up in the night and look at it and just, sort of. I still do the same, actually. I haven't really gotten over that.
But did it represent, did you see a future in it?
Yeah, for me, I was always convinced. Yeah, I mean, I remember saying that to my parents, like, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to be a musician. They go, yeah, but what do you want to do for a living? No, I want to be a musician. We didn't know a single person who made their living from music. And I have no idea where this came from or what made me think I could make it work. But it did. So it worked out fine.
Were there artists that you were really listening to at that point? Or who was feeding your love of music? Who was turning you on to various artists?
Well, it was just the radio mostly, but radio in those days was very, it was everything. You heard everything. I mean, I remember, the first one I really remember identifying was April Love by Pat Boone. And, but then there was all that horrible pop music that, oh God, what's his name? The producer did from CBS Records, how much is that Dougie in the Window and all that kind of stuff, which was not my favorite music. But then there was a turning point when two things. I heard Hang Down Your Head, Tom Dooley. I thought that was just amazing. And Lonnie Donegan, who I had not realized was basically just remaking all of Leadbelly's music. And so the formative moment for me was when I was about 13 or 14, and I walked into this record store in Christchurch. It was called the World Record Club, I think, on Cashel Street, if I'm remembering correctly. I might be remembering that wrongly. But and whoever was behind the counter said, you need to listen to this, and gave me this Folkways album, Leadbelly album. And I put it on, it was when you go in the booth and you put it on the turntable and you put the headphones on. And it was all the Lonnie Donegan songs that I'd grown up with, like Midnight Special and stuff like that. And but it was so much more authentic. I mean, I loved Lonnie Donegan. I thought he was incredible. But when you get to the sort of the mother lode, Leadbelly himself, and Leadbelly was a songster too, so he got that stuff from other people. Even though he's credited with writing that music, he probably didn't. He probably just heard that stuff in his travels. But it was so different. The Leadbelly versions were so electrifying and dangerous. Really, I mean, that was it for me.
And so, when you actually started performing, was that the kind of music that you gravitated towards?
Not really. I mean, because then what happened was this was the early 60s. So the Beatles came out, and that was, I can remember exactly which floor tile I was standing on in my kitchen when Love Me Do came on the radio for the first time. And it was like, I just knew that life would never be the same again. I could just tell. I have a really good ear for timbre, for tone, and which I suppose is why I became a producer and engineer. And I knew that I'd never heard that guitar sound before. I'd never heard that drum sound before. I'd never heard that bass sound before. And I'd never heard, the sort of that dominant seventh thing that happens in rock and roll quite the same way. I was never really a big Elvis Presley fan. And then I immediately moved to the Rolling Stones. And those first two albums where they were basically remaking all the old Chess records, I didn't know that at the time, but later figured that out. Those were so amazing to me, and songs like Time and things like that. It was just another level of music that I didn't even know existed. It was completely inspiring. So,
and as you're getting deeper into this world, what's happening in the rest of your life? How is school faring? You mentioned earlier that you're an introvert. Is this pulling you more and more just into focusing on music?
Yeah, well, before I got into music, I was really into, soccer and tennis and things like that. But then music, just like that, all just ended overnight. So it just became music and girls, and it turns out they work together really well.
And what did your parents actually do?
They both worked in factories. So, my family's really working class. My father was a shoemaker. It's what they call a clicker. They cut out the shoes. And my mother was a seamstress. She made clothes and bags and things like that. And they were both like super handy. They would, my mother would make a dress at like 5 o'clock on a Saturday night and go out in it, And And my father could make or fix anything. He was pretty amazing. He was the smartest guy I ever met, actually. But neither one of my parents. So I'm like the first person in my family to go to high school, actually. My father left school when he was around 10 or 11 because his mother and father both died. And my mother left school when she was about 13, I think it was. So, but, you know, they were smart. They were intelligent people. And especially my father, he could do mental arithmetic like nobody I've ever met in my life. You know, it taught me a lot about, you know, smarts, intelligence, and it's not all about education, even though at this point I have a PhD, but I have a very healthy respect for people who have, you know, they're just smart people. They may still have rough edges. They may not be super well educated or super refined, but they can figure things out. And I really admire that.
Did the fact that you were the first person in your family to go to high school, did that put an element of pressure on you? Was there an expectation from your parents that you'd been given this opportunity to set yourself up for perhaps a more traditional life than going into music?
I mean, there was an expectation of a more traditional life, but not in the same way that a lot of my friends got that kind of pressure. You know, you have to become a doctor, you have to become a lawyer. My parents didn't see things that way. They just wanted me to be happy. So I think I was incredibly lucky like that. They were very worried about me being in music, for sure. And then one day, we were just chatting, and they found out I was making more money than my father, and they were okay with it after that. You know, it's like, oh, really? You know? So, no, they were. I think I was really blessed in that regard. They have really, they were very open, and you know, they always just say, "Look, we just want you to be happy."
And I know that after you moved into the Christchurch band scene, and you're playing in the scene around then, but I think your first sort of real break came with the Wellington outfit, the Quincy Conserve. Was that a steep learning curve?
Yeah, it was. I've got to tell you, that was the most amazing thing ever, because I wanted to move out of New Zealand because, you know, I realized it was very small at the time, and, you know, it's hard to imagine now, but you couldn't even make a long distance phone call from New Zealand. It was like a pound a minute or something like that. You know, you just didn't. I mean, you wrote letters. So it was very, very difficult to get beyond a certain level in New Zealand. So, and I went to Australia, and I lived in Sydney for a year because I thought, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to go to England, and everyone's going to say, what's Australia like? And I'm not going to know. So I went to Australia, and that was a great experience for me because at the time it was all these great bands like Max Merritt and the Meteors, which was a Christchurch band actually originally, but Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs and people like that. And, you know, I remember watching some great drummers in all those bands. It was Stewie Spears and Max Merritt. He was like, God knows how old he was. He was, I think, in his 60s at the time, but an amazing player. And a lot of really great players around. And then I took lessons, and I've forgotten the name of the guy I took lessons from. That really was formative also. You know, I learned some stuff. I had great teachers in New Zealand, but, you know, every teacher brings something different. And that's when I went to practicing like 8 to 12 hours a day. I was very determined to do this. I moved back to Christchurch for the Christmas holidays, thinking, you know, and I'd booked a boat trip to the UK. I was going to go to the UK. And one day I just got this phone call out of the blue, and I think my mother picked up the phone, so she said, it's this guy, Peter Dawkins. So I pick up the phone and I go, you know, I can't remember what I said, but it was something along the lines of, come on, stop messing around, you know. And because Peter was the biggest producer in New Zealand at that moment, and ultimately he went on to be a huge producer and record label executive in Australia. But it was Peter, and he said, you know, would you be interested in auditioning for Quincy Conserve? It was just it was one of those kind of fairy tale stories, really, because, you know, not only was the Quincy Conserve working 6 nights a week at the Downtown Club on Lantern Key, but they were also the house band at HMV Studios in Wellington. So, you know, during the day we would be doing sessions all day, and then at night we were playing 4 hours a night, which, you know, it sounds like hard work, but I mean, I just love to play. I still love to play. So, you know, it was like, oh man, 4 hours, can we keep going? You know?
Hey, it's Rod here. Now, the quality of the Zoom connection deteriorated for the next minute or so I'm going to fill you in quickly on what we talked about. Basically, after finding success in New Zealand, the Quincy Conserve decided to move to Australia. But when one of their members pulled out, Richard opted to leave the band and jump on a boat to England, but not before applying to the Berklee College of Music, which is where we pick up the conversation.
Yeah, so there's a story there too. So I went, there was an American drummer in the London Symphony Orchestra, I can't remember his name, but I was taking lessons. I'm a big believer in, I like suck people's brains dry. If somebody knows something I don't know, I want to find out about it, and I'll pay them any amount of money to teach me. So I'd been taking lessons from someone, and, it was a small scene in Wellington. We used to hang out in various music stores. I ran into this percussionist, principal percussionist for the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, and, I'd mentioned to him, and I'd done my research, and there were like 3 schools in the U.S. that did modern American music studies, which is what it was called at the time, basically jazz. And there was Berklee, and there was one in Chicago, and there was one, it was Indiana in Bloomington, and blanking on the name of the one in Chicago. But anyway, and I mentioned to this guy, I'd really like to go to Berklee. And he said, you'll never get in there. That's just for genius musicians, So I thought, well, screw it, I'll apply anyway. So by that time, I'd played on probably 10 albums, maybe more. So I packed up like 10 albums that I thought were good, and I mailed them off to Berklee and didn't think any more about it, with a nice letter, handwritten. Then I got on this boat to go to England. I got to New York. We went through Tahiti and the Panama Canal in New York. And I got to New York and I got mail from home. I got this letter from my mother saying, you got a scholarship to go to Berklee. And so I really didn't know what to do. I'm like, what do I do? Do I get off the boat and go up to Boston now? But it turned out it was for like 6 months from now. So I went on to England, and then I flew back to Boston to go to Berklee. And that was an amazing experience, because I studied with Alan Dawson, who taught Tony Williams of Miles Davis when he was 16, and Tony Williams' lifetime, one of my still all-time favorite drummers. And Alan Dawson was just an amazing inspiration.
What do you remember feeling when you turned up? Because it is, as you said, it's a place where you'd been told that you couldn't get into. It's got an incredible reputation for the musicians who go there. Was there a sense of imposter syndrome, or did you feel completely at home there straight away?
I was terrified, and the reason I was terrified was because I never took school seriously. I did fine at school, but I never cared about it really. I just wanted to get through it. It was a qualification, and so I remember getting there and thinking, "Oh crap! Now I really have to. This is important to me. If I fail at this, I've failed at the thing that's really important to me." And I realized that this was the best of the best of the best, So like from every little town and city around America and around the world, people who had sort of risen to some level were now putting themselves in Berklee, which actually turned out not to be 100% true. But, I was really terrified. And actually it worked out great. I remember we sat in the first day in class, there's probably 300 kids in the class, and the professor came in, did this speech about it, and he said, look around you. He said, 3 people in this room will make a living from the music industry. So, of course, I'm looking around thinking, who are the other 2? I should hook up with them. I mean, it wasn't just pure arrogance. It probably was pure arrogance, but it wasn't, because I'd already been making a living, and I'd been a professional musician since I was 14, but full time since I was 15, because I graduated high school when I was 15. So I'd been working, for 5-6 years by then, and I was a couple of years older than most of the kids going there. There were some incredible players there, I have to say, incredible. But I was surprised that I wasn't far behind them, and I could catch up. It was, but there were some things that were a little bit shocking to me. I mean, I remember doing ear training class. I had never had an ear training class in my life, and and the guy sits down and he starts playing a melody on the piano and he says, write it down. I'm like, well, what do you mean? How do you do that? And so I had to do a lot of woodshedding to figure out how you can. So I don't have perfect pitch, but you have to develop good relative pitch. It's not as hard as you think, but it seemed like impossible that first day.
Sure.
So, oh my God, I'm going to die here. This is.
And what about your time with Alan? Is there any lessons that you learned from him that still resonate with you today?
Yeah, ask a really interesting question 1 minute before the end of the lesson, and you'll be there for another hour and a half, and you'll piss everybody else off who's outside the room waiting for a lesson. But I managed to get like an hour and a half lessons every day because I'd say, so Alan, when you do, where are your fingers? And he was away. He was such an enthusiastic person. He was such an amazingly sort of ebullient kind of character, and really phenomenal player. It was magic just to sit there and watch him do something.
After the break, Richard talks about inventing the SDS-5 and the key quality that's informed his career. Welcome back to Humans of Music and my interview with Richard Burgess. Before the break, Richard talked about travelling to London and then heading over to Berklee. One of the bands he played with in London was called the Burning Egan Trio, and it was through that band that Richard met a 13-year-old drummer called Rusty Egan. 7 or 8 years later, Rusty went on to found a London club called The Blitz with Steve Strange, all around the time that Rusty and Steve formed the band Visage. The Blitz became a focal point for the burgeoning New Romantic movement. You'd find people like Boy George in there before he became famous with Culture Club, and it was where Richard first saw Spandau Ballet play. By this time, Richard was in the band Landscape, with whom he unwittingly coined the term EDM. But I'll let Richard tell that story shortly. For now, we pick up the conversation talking about the Blitz and what it was like to walk in there on an average night.
Well, it was bizarre, because we'd just come out of the punk movement, which was, spiky hair and ripped jeans and T-shirts and, crosses and safety pins and stuff like that. And suddenly it was, and this is where the New Romantic name came from, really, was, it was like some kind of Edwardian, frilly, frou-frou kind of dandyish environment. And, some bizarre stuff. I mean, girls with togas where, one breast showing, and there was a lot of bizarre stuff happened on the dance floor there, and just in general, I mean, it was a very sort of decadent scene, shall we say. And it's interesting because when I arrived in England, I always say, they slammed the door on the swinging 60s just as I got off the boat. And it did definitely feel that way. England was a grim place. I mean, my first year there, they had like on and off 4 hours of power cuts. Every 4 hours, the power would go out because of the miners' strike. And this was under Edward Heath. And it was cold and it was miserable. London was really run down. It's still post-war. Nothing much had really been fixed up. And it was still pretty grim at the end of the 70s. But the whole Blitzkrieg thing was kind of like flew in the face of that, whereas punk was sort of like an angry response to it. It felt like the New Romantic movement was more sort of like, well, screw it, we're going to have a good time and we're going to be fabulous and we're going to be amazing. So the minute I walked in there, I just knew this was something that could explode worldwide. And I've always been fascinated by those movements that explode, like punk in London in 76, and I guess punk in New York in 67, 68, whatever it was. The whole swinging 60s thing that happened around, I guess, 62 in London. And then later the Minneapolis scene. I've always been fascinated by how those things happen. And it's very often traceable down to one or two people. And definitely the New Romantic thing was. I mean, it was really, Steve, who was the look, and Rusty, who was the sound. And, I think, I always credit Rusty with that. He basically sort of created the soundtrack for, the 80s, the early 80s, certainly in my opinion, because he cobbled together all this kind of electronic music that it wasn't a scene at the time. You had Kraftwerk on the one hand, you had, the bands, the other German bands like Can and things like that. But then you had, Roxy Music and Bowie, and you had my band Landscape and Ultravox. But we weren't a scene until the Blitz happened, and suddenly we were kind of a scene. There was a futurist scene and the New Romantic scene, but they sort of melded together in some way. And I think it was it was an incredible lucky break, really, to have met Rusty and to have known him and to have, been able to get into, because I mean, they turned Mick Jagger away. You couldn't just walk into the Blitz Club if you weren't, cool. And I wasn't that cool. I wasn't particularly cool.
You mentioned the new romantic term, which you're often credited with inventing, and you're also credited with inventing the term EDM after you wrote it on the back cover of the Landscape single European Man. What's it like to see a term you've coined, like new romantic, for example, become part of popular culture?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, but I think, it's probably, I always say you got to kiss a lot of frogs, to find a prince. And I always also say I have 1,000 ideas to get one good one. It's the same with EDM. I mean, we came up with that, and it's on the single European Man. We called that EDM1. And we even wrote on the back, EDM, electronic dance music, computer program to perfection for your listening pleasure. And, we really did think about that one. We thought, well, okay, so this is new romantic. What do we want? We're not really new romantic, so we want to be something else. So we came up with electronic dance music. But, the thing is, these things are floating around, too. So there are probably other people that might have said it or said something similar. Who knows? Maybe I heard it somewhere. I have no idea. But I know with EDM, we definitely sat down and thought about it, and we made sure it was on the back of the record, and we called it EDM1. But it was actually many, many years before that was really picked up as a term. So probably maybe it didn't even come from our use of it, but it did get used in the same exact way. So.
And you mentioned Landscape, and I think it's quite interesting because at the beginning you were very independent, releasing your own EPs on Event Horizon Records. And,
right.
and they did very well. And then you signed with RCA, and that first album didn't do as well as, I suppose, the ones that you had released yourself. Did that engender, obviously in your position now with A2IM and being very passionate about the independent music scene and independent artists, was that a key moment in your appreciation of the power of independence?
Well, by that time, I'd been signed to, I think, 4 major label deals. And by then I knew the pitfalls. Actually, I was even signed in Australia briefly to, I forgot, one of the members of the Easy Beats signed a deal. I mean, I remember being so nervous signing a deal. I felt like I was signing my life away. But I knew how major label deals don't necessarily work out. And when they don't work out, it gets pretty ugly. So I was dead opposed to signing a deal with RCA. We'd sold about 25,000 EPs of, I think, each of our EPs. I can't remember if it was both of them or each of them. But we were filling the Music Machine in London, which was later called the Camden Palace, 3,000, 3,500 people. We were putting on our own shows in town halls. We would rent the town hall. We would, have circus acts go on in front of us because we didn't want bands because it would mess up our setup. And we were doing incredible numbers. We didn't really need a record deal. But we were a democratic band. We'd been together for 7, 8 years at that point. And, we had this very democratic policy. And so we took a vote, and 2 of us voted against the deal and 3 voted for. So we did the deal. There were plus sides and downs. There was an upside and a downside to that. One was, that we wouldn't have had the hit Einstein a Go-Go and the hit album From a Tea Rooms to Mars if we hadn't signed the RCA deal, because we wouldn't have even made that record. The downside was that it really changed the band, and I think ultimately broke the band up, because we were really we called it jazz punk. It was very aggressive, sort of electronic jazz funk sort of thing, very heavily improvised. It was an exciting band, probably the best band I've ever played in. And and actually, I'm just digitizing. I recorded every gig for about a year in 1977, so I'm just digitizing about 38 hours of tapes that I recorded on my Revox A77 at every gig, and I'm going to put them out, and we own those, and we'll put them out probably on Event Horizon Records again. But I've often wondered what would have happened if we would have stayed independent, and I'm reminded of it because I talked to Martin Mills, and he started Beggar's Banquet like the same year or no, I think 2 years earlier, before we started Event Horizon Records. I often wonder, you know, what would have happened if we'd have stuck with our own label, which I think we would have kept playing, and we were making enough money to make it work, you know. But what happened once we signed the deal with RCA was we made that first album, which was basically the same stuff we were playing live, but it was instrumental, and they just didn't know what to do with it. And also the way it was recorded, I hated. It was recorded very sort of, you know, in studio kind of environment. It had no life to it. And so we were about to make the second album, and having gone through these 4 other record deals, so now it's 5 deals, you know, I said to the band, I said, look, the same thing's going to happen. We're going to make a new album. They're going to put it out. It's not going to get on Radio 1. It's not going to get any airplay. It's going to die on the vine, and we're going to get dropped. And we will have sacrificed, you know, 20 songs across the 2 albums that we now don't have the rights to. Let's add vocals. Let's change up the band. I just bought the MC8 microcomposer, which was a life-changing machine. Let's do this with a computer. I just been working on inventing the SDS5 electronic drums with Dave Simmons, and I realized we could trigger that from the computer. This was before the first programmable drum machines. The LM1 really was the first very easily programmable drum machine, the Lindrum. And so we did. You know, and I was surprised. The band was like, yeah. And nothing was ever that easy. Nothing's ever that easy in a band. For some reason, it was like super easy. I think everyone was in the same mental state. And we did. We wrote and produced that album. We didn't have a huge budget, so we did it in, I think, 11 studios. We would pick up cancellation time around London, and we would constantly moving around London with reels of 2-inch tape and all our equipment. But, you know, that's an exceptional album, I think. I mean, if I might say so. You know, I still look back. People say to me, what's the favorite album you've ever made? And I have to say it's that album. You know, I feel that we just hit a sort of moment where we really, we had something very special going on in the band. And even though it wasn't the same music that we were making as an improvising live band, there was a very special magic going on between the 5 members of the band, and a very special kind of understanding that it just doesn't happen very often. You know, you really appreciate that when you get that.
Mm. You mentioned the Simmons SDS5, which you invented. And I guess when you take that in conjunction with coining terms like new romantic and EDM, and I know you'd mentioned in the past that your dad really liked to tinker with electronics, so that there's clearly a real innovative streak to your career, and that suggests an incredible curiosity. Is that one of the driving factors in the way you've followed your career?
It's everything, actually. I mean, I you know, if I don't have curiosity, I have to move on. And that's why this year when, with A2IM, when COVID-19 hit, and I was on a plane back from, well, actually I was on a plane to London on the 21st of February, and I read a CDC report, and then I looked up a WHO report, and I realized this is going to be really bad. So I texted or emailed our lawyer in LA and said, check all the cancellation clauses and all the force majeure clauses and all our contract. And in the middle of that trip, and I flew back on March 1st from Paris, I had already decided that we were going to pivot to a virtual conference and a virtual awards show. And whilst it was sort of necessity, at the same time, I'd never been more excited. You know, it's like, wow, this is such an amazing opportunity. And then again, I mean, actually, the team I have at A2IM is sort of like being in landscape again. I mean, it's an amazing team. It's a young team. It's an excited team. They're full of ideas, and they just like bought into it. You know, I thought, oh, they're gonna go, no way. You know, but no, everyone just bought into it, and then added like 1,000 better ideas than the ones I'd had, which is always the mark of a great collaboration, I guess. It was the same thing with inventing the Simmons. I'm very collaborative, by the way. Almost everything I do is done in collaboration with other people. I almost never do things on my own. And I love that sort of thing where you come in, you go, oh, I got this crazy, I mean, you're going to think I'm out of my mind, but what about, and they go, yeah, but what about it? And you go, that's even better. And, you know, and it's, so I love that kind of energy. But But you said it perfectly. Curiosity, really. It's just like, what if we did this? What if that? Why isn't, those are the keys to innovation, really. And the Simmons came out of, we were in the car one day and we were driving up. We were doing sound check. And JJ and Charlie, who went on to be in the Art of Noise, and that's the whole story is connected with us as well. He was one of our two crew members, and he used to set up the sounds while I was playing drums, and then Chris Eaton, the keyboard player, would play the drums, and I would go down and set up, finalize the sounds on the drums and everything. And I realized that our whole band was DI'd except the drums, and everything sounded incredible until you push the drum mics up, and then everything sort of dissipated. It became loose and sloppy. And why don't we have electric drums? And I actually invented electric drums. I actually still have that invention. I still have all the prototypes. But then I thought, well, we have electric guitars, but we're way beyond electric guitars now. We're at electronic. We're at electronic keyboards. And at that point in time, they were bringing out MIDI guitars, which haven't really caught on. But at that point in time, it looked like guitars were going to go electronic as well. So I thought, well, why don't we just, sort of leapfrog electric drums and go straight to electronic drums? And the Syn drums were out, and there was another one called Synair. But they didn't really sound like drums. They just did that boo thing. And I remember calling Joe Pollard, who invented Syn drums, and said, look, Joe, this could be amazing, but you need to, add some attack on the front of it. And he just wasn't having it. He thought the Syn drums were the beginning and the end of it, everything. And so I just gave up. And then I stumbled across Dave Simmons because he was importing the Lyricon that John Walters was using. And he had he had made a thing called the STS-3, which was very much like the Syn drum. It actually sounded exactly like the Syn drum. And I went to Dave and I said, Dave, this is what we need to do to make this function like a drum set. It won't sound like a drum set. I don't want it to sound like a drum set, but it'll do everything that a drum set does. It'll be adequate for a drummer to play and sound like a drum set. So my original intention was that drummers would play it. Actually, my original intention was I would play it. My only desire in doing it was that I would have one. I didn't care. I never thought of it as a business or anything else. I just thought of it as I want one. And then partway through, building the thing, I was also messing with the MC8, and I realized that I could trigger the drums from the MC8, and that was a whole other mind-blowing kind of concept, because no one had really made an album triggered by computer. So this was, that just added a whole other dimension. And actually, the first record that was where the drums were actually played by a musician was Chant Number 1, the Spandau Ballet record, which was the sort of first single off the second album that I produced. So my intention was always to play it, but that's not the way it wound up. I did wind up playing it, but I got more caught up in the whole programming side of things, which was never my thought. But that's where curiosity takes you, right?
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned Spandau Ballet, and obviously you produced the first couple of records with them and had great success with that at the same time as Landscape was having success with Einstein A Go-Go. But at some point, you looked like you made a choice to move more into production. Was that an actual decision?
To be perfectly honest with you, it was RCA. I mean, RCA just, like most major labels, do not really take artists' careers seriously. Now, I mean, obviously there are artists out there who do really well, and they're fine. But I mean, RCA never really knew what to do with us. I mean, honestly, the Two Rooms of Mars album would never have been a hit if it wasn't for an 18-year-old girl called Jackie Bucknell, who happened to be one of the Blitz kids, and she was also an assistant up at RCA. And when after I produced Spandau Ballet and the first record, to cut a long story short, broke, they were having a marketing meeting, and someone said, we need a band like this. And Jackie, bless her heart, 18 years old, right? She pipes up, she goes, you have a band like this. And they said, we do? And she said, yeah, you have a band, Landscape. Because Rusty was playing our stuff all the time at the Bliss Cup, and suddenly we had their attention. And that's what enabled the Tears of Mars album to do well. But then when we got to the second album, they just kind of, it's actually the third album for RCA, they just weren't really with us and didn't really care. And then the CEO, what was he, the managing director, who loved me and loved the band, he wound up, out of all the success we were having, getting transferred to the New York office, which was a much bigger job for him. And the new managing director that came in had some kind of issue with me, with us. And we had a record at the time that was I think it was jumping up 25 places a week on the chart, and he just pulled it. He just decided to pull all the money. And I'm saying, wait a minute, it just jumped up 25 places 3 weeks running. And it got to like, these were the days when you could climb up the chart from 198 all the way up to number one. That is really not so easy. Certainly in the UK, it's not so easy anymore. But you could back then, and we did. So, when that happened, I was so disgusted, and I was getting overwhelming amounts of offers to produce. So I naturally just fell into that, and I wouldn't describe myself as a workaholic. I have a Trojan work ethic, which I got from my parents. I love to work. I love what I do. And I always have loved what I do. I still love what I do. And so for me, to sit around and do nothing was not an option. To get paid lots of money to produce bands and, be in the studio doing different things every day was really amazing. So I moved in that direction. The other thing was, I did discover from, the Tea Rooms album that I didn't really like being a front person. It goes back to the introvert. I was fine being behind the drums, and I was fine singing on records and, doing all that. But, I don't have that front person personality really. And so producing's an amazing gig. A studio musician's an amazing gig for me because, every day you're doing something different. It's all 100% creative. You never have to do the same thing twice. When you're a front person in a band, you play the same song like 1,000 times. You're on 1,000 different shows, and it just, for me, that's boring. So producing, you're working on different stuff all the time, new band, new personalities. It's exciting.
After the break, Richard talks about working with Kate Bush and Lou Reed and some of the issues currently facing the music industry. Welcome back to Humans of Music and my interview with Richard Burgess. One of the artists Richard worked with as a producer was Lou Reed, and we pick up the conversation talking about that experience.
He was such a nice guy and very soft-spoken, gentle, and he was thinking about building a home studio, so I was advising him on that. We were in a place called Swan Yard in London, which was a really amazing studio at the time. It's in, can't remember the area now. But anyway, it was a really beautiful studio. And he was super nice. Everything was going great. We were mixing. There were two tracks, 2 takes from the live show. It was the Policeman's Ball, I think it was, Secret Policeman's Ball. And he, said, I prefer this take, so we're going to do that. So we're working on the take. We're pretty far progressed with the mix. And the door to the studio opens. It's a big control room. These were the days when control rooms got really big. And door opens, and this guy sticks his head in, and he said, Lou. And Lou turns around, and he said, and I've forgotten who the producer was of the film, but he said, producer says we want to go with take 1, I think it was. And I've never seen anything like it. I thought the paint was going to peel off the walls. Lou turned from being this quiet, soft-spoken person, and it was almost like flames came out of his mouth across the room, and he just this person just stood there and withered, and he just he said, okay, and shut the door and walked off, and Lou turned back to me, he said, yeah, let's finish it, and and we finished the mix, and that was the one that went on the album.
That's incredible.
It was an amazing moment.
Yeah. And was Peter Gabriel involved on that?
Peter wasn't in the studio at the time. I do know Peter because I actually met Peter because of the Fairlight CMI. There were 3 Fairlights that came out of Rushcutters Bay, which you know well, and one went to Peter, one went to Psychosystems, and one went to me. Peter had the first one, so John Waters and I from Landscape drove out to Bath, where Peter had his house and a studio, and we met with Peter, and we sort of messed around a bit with the Fairlight, and he played us the first. He played us the roughs of the album of Peter Gabriel 3. It was called in the UK. It has the Intruder on it, and that's the first example of the Phil Collins drum sound. And I remember he played it to us, and I couldn't believe it. It sounded so good. That record's such a good sounding record, and I couldn't believe that drum sound. And I knew Hugh Padgham really well, who was the engineer on that. And so I immediately called Hugh, and I got to get that drum sound here. So there were 2 tracks on the 2 Rooms of Mars album where we went into Townhouse 2 and used that Stone Room, and it was not exactly that sound, but we definitely used that technique of the compressed gated drum sound in that Stone Room, the exact same room. I knew Peter from that, and then the Peter Gabriel Fairlight connection is how I wound up working on the Kate Bush Never Forever album, because I think Peter recommended that she come to me because she wanted to use the Fairlight, and I guess Peter was too busy, and I don't know if it was Steve from Psycho or whether it was Peter, but I got a call from Kate, and that was an amazing experience working with her as well.
Working with people like Kate and Lou, and I know you've worked with people like Tony Visconti as well. Are there qualities that you see in these people that they have in common?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think definitely, yeah. I mean, open mind, I would say, curiosity, a lot of technical ability. I mean, the people I really admire have a lot of technical ability, and I don't think that's absolutely essential, but I mean, Tony Visconti is one of the most accomplished musicians I've ever worked with. I mean, he can arrange strings and horns, and he's a great engineer, really accomplished producer, definitely somebody I admire greatly. That was one of the great things about being a studio musician, is I got to work with a lot of really great producers, all the great producers in the UK and some of the Americans as well. I mean, Kate was endlessly creative. I mean, they're all highly creative people. They're never short of an idea. They never get stuck on something. Constantly curious. I think those are the qualities I associate with those people. I work with a lot of people I think were terrible as well. In some ways, I learned more from the people who were terrible than the people who were good. I worked with one producer who used to just say, and he wasn't actually a terrible producer, he was a very successful producer, but his whole thing was, do it better. He said, just do it better. And
do it better or do it bad?
Do it better. And I mean, it's not very useful that when you're a musician, you're sitting there going, sure, I would love to. Which direction do we go in here? Someone like Visconti, totally not like that. See, Visconti would give you very precise directions. That was really cool, but those fills are a little busy or something like that. Something a bit simpler. You need to tune the snare drum down. It's just somebody who knew. And the other thing with people like that is they know every instrument. Kate was like that. On Never Forever, when we were doing Army Dreamers, I mean, that was her brother Paddy had like an armory of guns, and so he brought all his guns in, and we were cocking rifles and sampling them and playing them back, and she had a very good sense of what pitch she wanted them and stuff like that. It was a constant, back and forth dialogue, but it also was not a dictatorial environment. I find that the people I admire, it's never a dictatorial environment. It's like a creative, free-flowing, kind of excited, collaborative experience. You feel like you're working together to produce the best possible result, and any idea from anybody anywhere in the room could be the one that does it for you.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm going to jump forward a few decades past your work with Smithsonian Folkways into your current role at A2IM, which you've been the CEO of since 2016. The experience you mentioned before with RCA and how you felt that the major labels didn't treat artists' careers with respect, did that inform what you wanted to achieve with A2IM?
Very much so. I think, what I regret about the music industry, and I think it's gotten worse and worse over the years, is that it's very hard to be a middle-class musician these days. From the age of 14, I made a living. I mean, I did work a couple of day jobs out of school because my parents wouldn't countenance the idea of me sitting at home and just playing gigs. It was a working class thing. Why are you going to do that? But I really didn't need to. I was making enough money not to work. That's not so easy to do these days. And people forget that. People forget that, back in the 60s and 70s, there was no way to get free music. I mean, the radio, but you couldn't get music on demand free at all. It just didn't exist. And musicians could actually make a living. Even not famous musicians, middle-class musicians. And I think that the independent sector, whilst it's incredibly, it has a wide dynamic. You've got labels that have number one hits on the Hot 100 and Top 200. You've also got labels that will never appear on the charts, but they're making considerable amounts of money for their owners, and they're supporting careers of artists and bands, in sometimes through selling recordings, and sometimes through just making recordings and enabling bands to get out on the road and make money and sell vinyl and T-shirts and things like that. So there's a lot more. There's a lot more to the recorded music industry than just putting out a record and either having a hit or not having a hit. And the other thing that's happened is more and more is there is no second and third album if you don't have a hit. Like Bruce Springsteen didn't have a hit until his third album. I think Fleetwood Mac really never had a big hit until their, I think, 16th or 17th album. But they were out on the road. Bands that I thought were huge, like Little Feat, they were only selling 40, 50,000 copies. You'd get dropped from a major label, back in the 90s if you sold less than 500,000 albums in the U.S. I think that's a terrible shame. It's a blockbuster business model, and that's wonderful for the people who have the blockbusters, and no shade on them at all. I've had some very big hits, and I'm very proud of them, and I'm happy for the artists, and I'm happy for myself. But I'm also very proud of the records that weren't blockbusters, and I would like to think that artists that are doing something worthy can actually have careers and make a living without having to have a blockbuster. And I think we sort of screwed the pooch in that regard, and I'm trying to sort of unscrew the pooch as much as I can in this role at A2IM.
What do you have an idea of the way out of that? How to unscrew that pooch?
Well, I think we have to educate people that music cannot be free. I mean, we don't live in a society where food is free or rent is free or anything else is free. And there's no reason why music should be free. There's kind of been an assumption since Napster that music's just like air. We heard all those euphemisms that came out of Silicon Valley about free like beer and free like air and whatever. I can't keep up with all that. But really, there's just a gigantic manipulation by, tech companies to be able to capture the value from someone else's creation, and not return any of that value or enough of that value to the people who created it. So, you've got value creation and you've got value capture. And in an ideal world, they would be together. The people who create the value would also capture the value. But what's happened since Napster is the people who create the value are not capturing the value. You've got the tech companies capturing the value. And, it would be fine if it was an equitable split. I think that we got the closest we've gotten to an equitable split is probably Spotify and Apple. But even then, it's not really equitable. And you get the tech companies bitch about, oh, we only make a 30% margin. I've heard people say, well, it's tough. They're trying to survive on a 30% margin. I mean, Walmart survives on a 2% margin. Supermarkets don't make 30% margin. Most businesses don't make a 30% margin. You do a search on average margins in business, and it's only the tech world that makes 30 and 70. Google makes like 60% margin, which is fantastic. But it's one thing when you're making those kinds of margins off of something you created. It's another thing when you're making it off of something that someone else created and not returning enough of that value to the people who created it. You're basically, you're killing the golden goose.
Is the genie out of the bottle in that regard? Is it too hard to put it back?
It's hard to put it back. I don't think it's impossible. I wouldn't be doing this job if I thought it was impossible. And I'm pretty determined, So, I can't do it on my own, but I'm not on my own. And, the good thing is I am really collaborative. And although we're one of the smaller trade associations, we've been very successful at collaborating with the other trade associations. You have to make trade-offs, you got to make compromises. That's what collaboration is all about. I think that there are enough people that want to see it happen that it is possible. It's unconscionable that radio in this country does not pay artists, musicians, singers, producers, labels when they play a record. So Aretha Franklin never made a penny for all the plays that Respect got in the U.S. Now people go, well, she was rich. Yeah, but she should have been a lot richer. Music radio in this country makes $11 billion a year. Last year, the recorded music industry made $11 billion. So just music radio alone makes as much money for playing our music as we make for making our music. But that doesn't include Spotify, Apple, SiriusXM, Pandora, Amazon, Facebook. You can go on and on and on. So people, if you added it all up, and it's very difficult to add it up because you can't get the numbers from YouTube and places like that. If you added it up, people are making, in totality, music is generating probably 5 to 10 times the amount of revenue for people using it, for the people who are using it as a business model, than it is for the people who create it as a business model. That's not right.
And that's probably one of the biggest challenges, I imagine, in your time at A2M. Is that the biggest challenge that you've addressed?
Yeah, I would say it is, and I think it's an ongoing challenge because we're seeing, you see it's wave after wave. You had the first wave, which was Napster. And then the second wave really was, you had all those other things like LimeWire and Morpheus and Grokster and all those, sort of basically tried to, figure out what Napster did wrong and find some loophole to get around that. And then you had YouTube. And now you've got Twitch that's not paying anybody. And so it's really a problem. But the music industry has a history of letting this happen. In 1942, Capitol Records decided to start giving records to DJs to play because they noticed that when DJs played the records that they sold more records, at the local record stores near that radio station. Well, that's fine, but then within 3 years, every label was giving, they lost their competitive advantage very quickly, and they also screwed the pooch. They lost the ability to make money. They should have been selling the records to the station, which the station used to buy them from the record stores, and B, they should have been getting paid for every usage on the station, just like writers do. And we're still stuck with that, and it's been 100 years since 1920. 1926 was the first time, as far as I'm aware, that a congressperson spoke up about this, saying it's just not right that radio doesn't pay when they play records on the radio. And then in 1982, we did the same thing with MTV. Oh, great. Here's our videos. Play our videos. And it was great for the New Romantic movement because we were the only ones who had videos in the beginning. But it's a very short-sighted approach. Music should not be free. There's no reason why music should be free. It costs a lot of money. It's like that old thing, when you go into the studio musician and you play on a track and it's like, holy crap, we're going to pay hundreds of dollars for, 20 minutes work. No, you're not paying for 20 minutes work. You're paying me for 20 years of practice. And that's the thing with music. You're not paying, for this piece of music. You're paying for all those years of practice. You're paying for the years that people slept in bands in the freezing cold in London. And, I have no complaints. I'm not complaining about any of that. It was my choice to do it. But the bottom line is you do it because you think that at the end of it, you're going to be compensated. I was, but I don't think that this generation is getting compensated the same way that I was able to get compensated. So at this point in my life, I'd like to think that I might be able to do something about that. And maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm arrogant, but I'm certainly going to give it my best shot.
Well, how important is it for artists, and particularly independent artists, to maintain control of their copyright?
I think it's horses for courses. I'm not hard line about every artist owning their own copyrights. I think that you have to figure, it's an equation. What do I give up in return for what do I get? And, if someone's going to give you $1 million, the chances are they're going to want the copyright, at least for a long period of time. Maybe not in perpetuity, but maybe. I hear of $7 million deals on 7-year licenses. I don't know if they're really true or not, but I think that the smart thing is to own your own copyrights. But if you need money more than you need that, then you're going to have to trade off the ownership of the copyright. It might be a longer license or even an in perpetuity contract. I think the trick, though, and this is a point I've made to the majors quite a lot, is what really pisses artists off is unexploited masters. So it's one thing if you're successful enough that your back catalog is still being worked, and you can afford a high-end music industry lawyer, and you can go back in and negotiate your rates and get rid of all the packaging deductions and stuff. I mean, they're still taking packaging deductions off of digital streaming royalties, and you have to go in and fight them over it, and that's just not right. I think if you have to give up your copyrights in perpetuity, then you need to make sure that you've got some protections in there, so that if those titles become unavailable, there's some way of making them available, because it's not right. This is your legacy. Even if one person wants to listen to that thing, they should be able to do it, and they should be able to find it, especially in this day and age when almost everything's available. But everything is not available. It really isn't. And, there's this kind of illusion that everything's available because so much is available, but everything is not. And this is our cultural heritage. And it may be that some obscure cult band, maybe even a band that didn't even rise to cult level, did something back in the day that could be influential on somebody today that might spawn the next thing, because that's the way art works. The way art works, we all build on prior creators. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And it's not, outside of the creative sphere, that's not a well understood concept. But in the creative world, that's a very well understood concept. And so I think it's ultra important that everything be available. And I'm personally, if I was living my life again, I would have not signed with RCA, that's for sure. I probably would have made the first 3 or 4 mistakes because the money was attractive, and you thought the power of the major label was kind of incontrovertible. And as a young kid, you believe in your own ability. It's like, yeah, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be number one. But after a while, you realize there are a lot of factors. It's not just how good you are, how good of a record you make. It's also, does your A&R guy leave? Does he get fired? Does your Does your CEO, does she get transferred? Those kinds of things. And it's very often factors that have nothing to do with the quality of the record or the quality of the music or the quality of your creativity. It's, business factors that can determine whether your record does well or not so well.
Mm-hmm. And very lastly, Jaxsta is all about giving credit where credit is due. Are there people that you would give credit to for helping you get where you are today?
I mean, everybody I worked with, honestly. And I think, as you know, I'm a super big fan of Jaxsta. And I think that, as a musician, the only other thing that's more important than getting paid, I think it might be more important than getting paid in some cases, although I do think it's important to get paid, is credit, because credit is your future. It's your future gigs, it's your future income. And it outrages me that, as far as I know, music is the only area of copyright, I guess, IP, where when it went digital, it has less information than when it was physical. Like, you buy a Kindle book and you've got so much more capability than you did with a physical book. Even Netflix runs credits. I mean, you have to be a bit tricky to get them, but they are there. And, all the credits too. And that's because they have strong unions. But music, you can't find out who the drummer is or the bass player or the producer. And frankly, I think it's myopic on the part of the DSPs, because that's how I found out that I bought so many records because, this bass player played on it, or that producer, or this drummer, was on it, or whatever, and this background singer. I remember Rita Coolidge. I mean, if she was on a record, I would buy it, because I'm like, yeah, I mean, she's good. She's not going to be on a bad record, and she never was. And Chuck Rainey's the same thing. Ginger Baker, So, I think it's really Al Jackson Jr. Gosh, I bought so many records because these people played on them. So I really applaud what Jaxsta's doing. As you know, I was a fan right from I met Jackie probably 3 months into being in this job, and it was sort of love at first sight for the project, and I so admire what she's done and what you guys have done. So it's I think credits are really super important. I really hope you achieve everything that you hope to achieve.
Thank you, Richard. Well, look, Richard, thank you so much for your time. It's been so great to talk to you, and I feel like we've barely scraped the surface of your career in this time. So you never know. Perhaps there's a part 2 at some point, but it's been great chatting with you. Thank you.
Anytime, Rod. Thank you so much. It's very kind of you.
And that's it for another episode of Humans of Music. A big thank you to Richard for his time, and thank you for listening. This episode was mixed by Lachlan Mitchell from Parliament Studios in Annandale, and the incidental music and theme song were written and performed by Sam Lockwood. Please remember to subscribe to the Humans of Music podcast so you never miss an episode, or share it amongst your friends and jump online and rate and review it. And remember, Jaxsta Pro is currently free, so if you make music or work behind the scenes in the music industry, head to jaxsta.com and sign up to become a Jaxsta Pro member. Until the next episode of Humans of Music, I'm Rod Yates. Thanks for listening.